This broadcast will start in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Voice of Stockton. For more information on The Voice of Stockton, go to thevoiceofstockton.org.
This is KBCC 89.5 FM, Tracy, California, Peace and Justice Network of San Joaquin.
The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of KXVS The Voice of Stockton or its parents, affiliates, management, and staff.
Welcome to on the Saturday, June 1st, 2019. Welcome to the Voice of San Joaquin and my show, the Vigil show. Right now I have a very prestigious colleague at the board, Culture Heritage Board, Chairperson Wesley Swanson, and we'll be talking about the Culture Heritage Board and what their function and what it's all about. People want to know what is it, played a role between the city and the planning commission. So that's what we're gonna be talking about. So thank you for coming, Wes. I would like to also want you to let me talk to me if I didn't come anything. And also when I'm signing, I'll be signing it later. Okay, I'll reload the video. I'm gonna put closed caption there. Right now my hand hurt, my finger is acting up, arthritis. So I definitely will have it taken and downloaded. Okay? Now, Juan, thanks for coming.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And I would like to know, so tell me, what is the Culture Heritage is about? How did it start? Tell me the history about it.
Well, the Culture Heritage Board started in the 1980s. At least that's when the first buildings began to get listed. The purpose of the Culture Heritage Board was a reaction to the decaying situation with heritage buildings in Stockton. There had been kind of decline in the downtown from the 60s onward, and a lot of structures were being threatened. A few famous structures were destroyed, particularly the Cunningham's Castle, the old jail, and the old county courthouse that was seen in the movie. I forget the name of the movie. But anyway, the point was a lot of buildings had been destroyed, and so there was a reaction to try and set up a situation where buildings could be protected. The Heritage Board and the historic districts that followed it were set up in the kind of standard method, which is following Secretary of the Interior standards. So buildings that have a connection to a famous person, particular examples of architecture, first of, last of, way of life, things like that. The purpose of a building being historic can depend on many factors. A very ordinary structure can be historic as much as a particularly attractive one.
Okay.
The Heritage Board also is supposed to be an advisory kind of commission or board, so that, for example, the Planning Commission should seek assistance on whether or not there should be a plan for an additional or an expansion of a historic district, what types of buildings should be saved, what's important about California or Stockton's history. This kind of information should come from the board members, who are selected from a variety of professions that would support and have good practical knowledge and education of historic preservation. So the board is both an empowered listing agency to find and list historic structures, and then also it is an advisory. It's also tasked with education. It's supposed to do outreach to educate various members of the public, schools, and so forth on the important history of Stockton.
So as far as the concern is that, have been enforced during the time that I have been in the board recently? As far as that concerned, as far as the duty of the function of the Culture Heritage Board for educational awareness, advocating, and all that stuff that people I'm not familiar?
Well, mostly not.
Okay.
Since the board, in the last 4 years, before the current session, shall we call it, with the 2019 meetings, the board had, I believe, 1 meeting in 3 years.
Wow.
And it was a meeting with really no content.
Okay.
I don't even know why we actually called it. By city code, we're supposed to be able to determine time and location of the meetings, but we can't. We have to have support from the city. If the city doesn't provide that support, in particular agendizing our meetings, we can't hold them. So the board, in a sense of good faith, should be facilitated by the city, but is often, if it meets at all, it is entirely to the city's discretion, particularly the planning department, and very little actually happens.
So in other words, do you think that the planning, the community director, the word I'm looking for, have no priority on what the board equal? Because I know that the planning commission, the culture harbor, same thing with the civil service committee. We appoint set a salary commission, and they set up the salary and all that, and they pay for it, and they have people working side by side, and that's a priority. Here in the planning commission, have the similar effect with that with the culture heritage board. So are you saying that it's a priority of the discretionary from the director point of view at the community development?
Well, since the way it works, now city code doesn't say where we get support from the city. It just says the city will provide secretarial support, for example.
Okay.
But that's been traditionally through the planning department. And therefore, it would be at the discretion of the director of planning or development as to how the board, where and when it meets. Now, what's interesting about Stockton is I've been on the board long enough that I believe I'm on the third director, and there's a kind of institutional memory or impetus, shall we say, that preservation and heritage seems to be an extremely low priority in Stockton. What's amazing about Stockton is we have a grand total of listed sites, landmarks, and structures of merit around 65.
Okay.
I don't know the exact number at the moment. Some of them have ceased to exist, so the list has to be augmented. A city of this size should have 1,500 easily. Even small towns. Pacific Grove has more than 1,000, I believe. City of Sacramento has 30 plus historic districts and thousands of listed structures. The list in Stockton is extremely small. Other problem is that the board, even when the board has acted, the list is not augmented.
Right.
The curious thing about this is, if you look at the current 2040 plan, on the heritage page, one of the objectives is to appreciate the historic structures of Stockton, and the other one is to list structures. So even though this power has been granted to the Heritage Board, it's very, very rarely enacted, although it's listed as an objective.
But there's another one, they play two roles. One, what you say, a cultural heritage list, and one, what the other one?
Advisory.
Advisory. So, did it come together equally?
Well, it would if there was an active interest on the part of the planning of the city to preserve cultural heritage, to develop historic sections. So if there was a plan for heritage, then the board would be presumably requested to provide guidance and information. But the city has not initiated any heritage plans for, as far as I can tell, since the Hotel Stockton. The board is empowered to initiate landmarking and structures of merit, but both of those abilities have been under threat as long as I've been on the board. We ceased to be able to do landmarks back around, I'd say, 2011, when they initiated a fee structure. So that for the board to do its duty and initiate the landmarking of important structures, we don't have the, at that time, $4,000, and now it's $1,000 to submit the application.
So is the board responsible to come up with the $1,000 to foot the feed, or what?
The board has been suggested by the previous director that the board engage in fundraising, bake sales or something, to come up with the $1,000. The problem is, if you look at city code, the board will initiate. However, how do we do that if we have to have the money to do it? It's a voluntary operation. The Cultural Heritage Board is a civic volunteers who do it for no pay or service granted to them. So it's entirely a contribution to the city's improvement. We can do structures of merit without fee, except that it's so the process has become so mired red tape that even when we have been able to do it, it takes years to get one across. In the current session, as you know, we've been in session now since January. We've done one structure of merit, and that building has not been added to the list. In fact, in the last 4 years or longer, the few buildings we've been able to get through the process, none of them have been added onto the city's list.
So why is that? Why is it taking this long to when the board have already, like you said it, not putting it on the list of paperwork that we have provided for them? So can you request those type of information on a month-to-month basis? See the list is on the list
Well, the excuses have gone from it's in the process, we're working on it, staff limitations, to the time required to process the overwhelming number of applications, to the planning department lost several years of our records and minutes, so they no longer had the properties listed anymore. So basically the list, as far as I know, exists entirely on the internet. There is an official, on the city's website, there is a listing of structures of merits, landmarks, and historic sites. So it is outside of our control. The board has no ability to submit a list onto the internet. And that is entirely done through the services that are supposed to be provided for the board to function. Would be essentially the secretary of the board, who is provided by the planning department to carry out that operation. But I can't really speak for the planning department. It's just that it obviously has an extremely low priority.
But as far as I'm concerned, when they talk about, do the board request an applicant? Who are the application that was submitting, that they keep saying that they are overwhelming with application? Do the board have the right to look at what has been they're looking at the application review?
Well,
we can know
the applications to be processed are submitted. The board itself can initiate the application to itself. So we know what applications have been seen and which ones have been approved.
Okay.
We just don't control them physically after voting on them, in which case there's supposed to be a record, as in the minutes, and then the structure added to the official list. The way it used to be was there was a filing cabinet which had a manila folder in it, one for each structure.
Okay.
So the original application would be kept in a file, and there would be the description of why, the reasoning. As far as I know, those files do or don't exist. We've never seen them. We've made many requests, and we are always told they're working on it.
Okay, now I'm going to get off that for a moment. To the people that are listening right now, so what did the community benefit by the Coastal Heritage Board? If somebody like I did, this kind of concerning. I'm educated by people that already from the video archive. That's similar. That what benefit? Some say that they'll be be thankful that their home are listed as a historic. And then the opposition say if they find out that their house are historic, they don't want it. So what are the benefits to apply for their housing of the benefit for the constituent, from the people in Stockton?
If for basic listing in the state of California, the basic benefit of having a structure on a local listing, so this would be essentially just a list. The only benefit presently available would be the use of the California Historical Building Code. And this is a state law. It's a requirement. All cities have to comply with it. And the state Historic Building Code is essentially a flexible code system whereby a historic building may be upgraded to a more pragmatic approach.
Got it.
So if you want to reutilize an ancient building, it may or may not have to be brought up to total compliance with current code. This is essentially a flexibility negotiated with the local building department. In many cities, this is their entire historical plan, and it can be of great benefit in using an old structure, particularly when it comes to again, energy upgrades, in some cases certain kinds of ADA compliance and so forth. But it's always pragmatical and practical and safe. But the idea is that if you have an old building and you want to utilize it in some new and creative way, it'll make it less expensive.
Right.
The other two benefits are there's tax advantages. The federal government passed a thing called the Mills Act, And the Mills Act is a way for a property owner to negotiate a slower payment tax system. So if you put a lot of money into a building and you increase its tax rate, you can defer that tax payment over a negotiated period of time. And the idea would be is that if you wanted to revitalize, say, an old movie theater or a hotel or something, and the expected income will not meet the requirements for the payment of the cost within 2 years, particularly because the value will go up and the taxes will increase, you can defer those payments over a longer period of time. So it's essentially a way to encourage redevelopment of old buildings. Done in most major cities in California take advantage of this. Stockton does not. Now, the city of Stockton would have to opt in to do this, but it would be a benefit.
So what can we do to enforce the Mills Act as far as getting that? Because I know that the community director are not willing to do that.
Well, it's a kind of a chicken and an egg problem, because what you need is a motivated property owner that has a plan for revitalizing some historic or ancient buildings and can apply pressure to the building department, the development department of the city to work with them to use this benefit. But the problem is that when you don't offer that benefit and you're doing your own lobbying, that in itself is an expense.
Right.
So it really takes essentially a support group, a number of property owners that are interested, art groups, something to lobby for it. On the other hand, if the city simply opened the doors and said, we're open to the Mills Act negotiation and opened the door to it, you would invite people to come up with tax proposals. Stockton is overflowing with historic, unlisted, unused buildings that are decaying and falling apart that this could be a benefit for. So essentially it's a tool that the city, for whatever reason, chooses not to use.
Well, what I would, and I do believe what you're saying is irrelevant. What you're saying is true, because when it comes to culture heritage, when it comes to the housing and things like that, I bought home that is, it had to be a fixer-upper, and there was out of code, out of wiring, out of, there was built-in room in there, and my house is like almost 1920, corner house, but still, it's a lot of work. But still, somehow, the city are kind of like conflicted what the culture heritage is trying to do. It's trying to do something good, but yeah, they're more concerned about the safety, well-being. They're talking about the legal process and everything going on, but we're also concerned about, as a board, that yes, it does need the criteria need to be maintained to the safety standard. Is that right? Is that correct? So in that case, we need to alleviate some kind of disconcerting with that particular issue about the staff concerned about safety, rather looking at the good thing that we're trying to develop, the historic realm. Like right now, when I saw Commissioner David make a point about the Magnolia, and when I first came in, I said it's a Nordic, and then they're going down, and I think that's just like a one step to focus on that Magnolia area, to see if we can improve it and kind of build that up back together again. And 3 commissioners already approved. You're right. This will need to be done. So what can we do as the Cultural Heritage Board to make that, to show them that, look, this is what that's gonna be our priority, without being the staff putting in a stumbling block among ourselves?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't necessarily have an answer, because the problem is, if you're going to have a historic district, the first thing you have to do is maintain the historicity of the area. And the thing with historic buildings, in particularly historic district, is every contributing structure, and that means a building in the district which is arguably historic, it's in its own right, structure of merit, or a landmark, you need to maintain the integrity of the building, which means, for example, windows, doors, siding. In the case of the only thing on a ancient house that you would be very flexible with is the roofing material, because for fire. But essentially, the building has to be kept as original in the exterior as possible. Otherwise, you don't have a historic district. And then there's things about the changes to the appearances. So, for example, off
You mean talking about the community, you mean?
well, I mean the building, how the house could be altered
Okay.
other than the building.
Got it.
So, for example, in the case of a historic district, landscaping, fencing, things like that, they should be complementary. They don't have to be museum pieces, but they should be something which is maintaining the historic nature. They are removable. They increase safety, well-being, and so forth, but they're not losing structure. It's like, for example, if you look at a historic structure as a document, it'd be like taking a book and throwing out random pages and trying to read it. If you take out the historic windows, the siding, the trim, the spindles, the turnings, the materials that are used, pretty soon it's like the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz losing parts and not having a heart. You don't have the pieces anymore. And if you go down the Magnolia District, you'll notice that many of the now historic buildings, or were historic buildings, have Home Depot vinyl windows, off-the-shelf pinch-tip fences, steel gratings over windows, doors from Lowe's, pieces of fabric that remove the historicity of it.
Right.
And one of the things the Heritage Board is supposed to do is reevaluate. And you go look at the historic district, and if, for example, it no longer meets basic standard, you have to decrease the size. Arguably, I would say half of the historic district really no longer qualifies to be a historic district because of all the significant modifications to the buildings. How do you prevent that? Well, you do that with what's called code enforcement. But we have I've been on this board for at least 3 terms.
Well, 3 term mean
12 years.
12 years. Okay.
And which I'll be, I won't be on it much longer because of term limits have come in.
Okay.
But the point is that in that period of time,
You better teach me more.
in that
Yeah.
period of time, most of these changes have occurred, and we have lobbied, and on occasion I myself have accompanied people from planning to correct some problems with houses. The problem is that that's only been about 5% of the cases. Most of the time, when the houses are modified, if it ever goes to any kind of action, they always end up approving it, overriding the Heritage Board.
Are you talking about going to the planning commission?
No, the planning department.
Okay.
Planning commission is to advise and direct, make decisions. Planning department or the development department is day-to-day maintenance
Okay,
of the
so
city.
so in other words, they're not going through protocol then.
They're not following code.
So basically, what can we do to alert them? Say, look, you're not following the code of the procedure. At the person with the culture heritage, do you have the charter, the bylaw of everything?
Yes.
Do they have a copy of those?
It's chapter 16 in the development code, so every person has access to it with an iPhone or a computer.
Okay.
And the point is that the director himself has, or it could be a woman, of course, the director has great authority when it comes to enforcing the code on their own authority. And that means the requirement of if someone's pulling windows out of a historic house, they have to maintain the historic structure. The problem is, as the Heritage Board, all the Heritage Board can do is make these deficiencies be known to the director and staff, and hopefully they will follow through. But the reality is, it virtually never happens. The number of times where there's been an intervention for the sake of maintaining historicity in a building has been, I could count them on the fingers of one hand, and I think that's overly generous. If, on the other hand, the number of buildings, addresses, houses that we've brought to the attention of the city over the years, where there's been gross alteration of the structure, no interventions, not one. And that's really disappointing because, again, one by one, building by building, you no longer have a historic district. It'd be like going to a car museum, and all the cars are requiring wheels from Pep Boys and
Right.
aftermarket engines and paint jobs, paint
That's
colors.
totally true. Yeah.
So you do not have a collection of antique cars. You've got a collection of custom cars. And with all due respect, that's not the
true.
same thing.
That's a good concept. I do believe that. So in other words, the house is custom made, custom housing, not a Victorian or not. It's not cultural hair. It's not. What do you call it? historic in or revive, whatever.
Well, you can't learn from it.
You can learn it.
I've often been asked to, I consult quite often on old buildings. I will examine the building with the owner and point out what is real and what is not, and usually I can tell with some reasonable certainty when the different materials were used, and I can generally tell what's real.
So how do you back that up by your expertise when people like Mr. Swanson, what do you think about my property? And as a person with a realtor license, I want to know, okay, is this how it is historic, or if I want to bring some value to that for the owner, where do I get that information from?
Well, that's a good question. Essentially, I usually get it from old catalogs and materials, also by measuring. Because one of the things about materials, as you probably know, a 2x4 nowadays is 3.5 by 2.5, depending on who mills it, 2 5/8. 2x4s used to be almost 2x4s. Unmilled 2x4s were actually 2 by 4 inches. Milled ones would be a little bit smaller.
Right.
Siding on houses would vary, but they could often be an inch thick. There's the materials, how many knots are in it, the type of shape of the siding. So you can pretty much forensically examine the materials, and you can pretty much date it pretty well within a decade or so. You can also very easily tell modern materials that maybe are masquerading because they're always simply by the thinness. The siding has now got to where it's often under 3/4 of an inch. It's very, a lot of knots, it's not old growth, it's very wide grain, things like that. So depending on what you're looking at in the structure, you can pretty much identify it. Siding, for example, the little fingers, the over joints. You take a look at the thickness of that and you can tell if it's old or not. Doors, windows, all that kind of stuff. Windows are particularly easy. Do they have weight systems in them? You know, is it still operating the way windows were built? Are all of the bottoms of the windows and the sills of the doors at an angle? Stuff like that. So it's fairly easy to tell once you get kind of an eye for it. And then again, you can get old catalogs. Victorian houses were typically built from drawings in catalogs. They were actually manufactured, spindles and things. You can find the sections of the houses in the different catalogs. So for example, 1860s houses with a mansard roof, or an 1890s Queen Anne style house is going to have a 90-degree pitch ceiling covering the whole structure, and not the mansard semi-flat roof. And those are fashions. It's still a Victorian. A lot of the constants in terms of spindles and wood turning and all that is still the same. But you can look at the catalogs of a given decade and see the houses that were being built by the current ideas of what a house should look like.
Okay, now I'm going to move on to the next topic that's really kind of concerning. I believe with January, January, where you fill out an application for the PG&E, and they wanted to make an appeal for that particular agenda. You know what I mean?
Well, it's going back almost 2 years ago, actually. PG&E sent in an application to demolish.
Wait, hold on. Before there were two questions I want to answer, and then I'll let you answer it. One was to, they're talking about the appeal process, and then also we're going to talk about having. In the same time, in the meeting, we're talking about the money issue also, as far as they're concerned. So those are the two questions I want to ask you, and then go ahead.
Okay, well, ask me the first one.
The first one was, how did the PD start that situation, the problem when they wanted to appeal, and then when we passed it, that it's a historic landmark, and yet they didn't want to have that particular landmark to make it an appeal. Now, in the process of that, also making a landmark, they were gonna able to have some money generated to help restore the plaque for that particular building.
Well, no, let me go back, start at the beginning on this then. Almost 2 years ago, PG&E submitted an application to the city of Stockton to demolish two sites. It's down by Center Street, a little bit south of downtown. There's a large brick structure, still fairly extant, built in what we call a commercial Gothic style, like an old brick building, but with a lot of castellated style in the walls and things. And then there was an electrical site, and they wanted to, what I would call, scrape both of these sites just to sell the lots. I was unaware of the sort of deep history of manufacturing gas in Stockton. And this is what, again, is kind of the core of history. History is not Taj Mahals and where George Washington slept only. It is the things people did, and in particular types of industries. The city of Stockton had gas lighting in one of the earliest cities in California.
Wow.
Before the Civil War, there was a manufacturing gas industry. It sounds utterly crazy because
I would never just, in my own imagination, you would see it on a movie. You would see something like in gas lighting, things like that, and it's surreal.
Well, what's amazing is most people think that when you have gas lighting, that's natural gas coming out of the ground.
Okay.
But it's not. The original gas plants in Stockton were manufacturing gas. They would take an organic material and they would cook it in essentially a pressure chamber and make from this essentially natural gas, but it's sort of forcing out of it a methane. Okay. And then this would be piped under the streets and it would light lights in the houses. The gas plant in question is actually the last version of a gas manufacturing plant built, I think, around 1880. And it actually predates PG&E. There actually were 30 companies at one time in Stockton making natural gas, and in some cases mining gas, which is getting it out of the ground.
Okay.
This particular structure remained functional up through World War II almost as a backup plan for natural gas. The natural gas that we use in Stockton historically came from Paso Robles. They piped it up the coast. Before that was manufactured. Anyway, this industry essentially now lost to history almost because it's not a process that is used significantly in any industrial sense. Was very important to Stockton. It became one of its primary and major industries. It was even related, strangely enough, to the battleship Oregon from the Spanish-American War. One of the companies that built these manufacturing plants also built boiler systems for battleships. Okay. And so the gas pipes under the streets of Stockton were actually made from the decommissioned boilers of battleships and merchant vessels. So it's kind of a logical progression, steam engines. The first electrical generation in Stockton was done from the natural gas plant, where they built natural gas burning engines to run dynamos to make electricity. I believe it was a DC system, not the current AC system. But it was a very interesting industry. So PG&E hired a firm to research this, and I read the report. And of course, my reaction, instead of unimportant history, was this is extremely important industry. It's kind of like if California no longer had agriculture and it had been forgotten. And one day someone discovered the history of agriculture 2 centuries in the future. That would be terribly important to know about that. And one of the things about historic structures is if you've got the last one of something, that matters. And in Stockton, where it used to be called the Brick City, when you have the last one in Gothic commercial brick in Stockton, that's a very historic building. So the board and myself submitted an application to make the gas plant a structure of merit. So we were in direct opposition to the building being destroyed. What came to play during this period was PG&E decided to negotiate compensation to the city of Stockton. They wanted to go forward with demolitions, but they were offering education money to build some kind of historic memorial education monument to this industry.
I think that should be done.
And we were doing this. I was on the table negotiating with one of the planners with PG&E for how much money they would put up. And at the point where the negotiations actually reached the point of how much money, the city of Stockton planning department apparently had to pull the plug on it. The planner.
Why is
I
that?
have no explanation.
So okay. My assumption that as a person that just a window out there dealing with is, you think it's like an animosity of lessen the culture hazard priority of just giving permit demolition 30? Because I know that when I get an email from you guys from the city, I'm looking at the permit the demolition, and we can't do nothing about it. I'm just looking. It's all information, and yeah, we cannot even talk. When we go to the board, we can't even discuss about whether this building is whatever it is.
That's another issue. Back in.
No, but stick to what you were saying. I was trying to get off the subject, but I didn't want to get to that. But
I like that topic. Come back to that. But the thing is with the PG&E building is that we ended up with the PG&E building, the gas plant, on our agenda to approve as a structure of merit, which again is just listing it. It doesn't actually prevent anything from happening to the building. It does, in terms of exact wording, change the maintenance requirements. However, they're extremely minor, and actually they're enforced under the same chapter as as any building in Stockton. But even that's not really an issue, because there's no intervention police that stop buildings from being neglected. But the point is that we got it on our agenda to approve it, and at the 11th hour, I was asked as chair to remove it from the agenda, which has already been published, using what they called a around the bench memo, which I have no idea what that actually is, because I was unable to find any city who uses such a thing other than Stockton. But basically it looked like their request was to allow PG&E to come to the meeting to assist us in our decision. Well, PG&E had been contacted and told that this meeting was going to occur and that the building's fate of being historic or not was on the agenda, but it was inconvenient for them to come, so they were asking us to reschedule the meeting. Well, as you know, that's almost impossible. If we get something on the agenda, it's a miracle. So I did not drop it from the agenda, and we proceeded to vote on it, and it passed unanimously. The evidence of that building being historic is utterly overwhelming.
But the thing is that during that time, that meeting, I remember that when you said an unanimous, the staff were against it. The staff was much against what we were proposing, even though we were. You know, that's the thing about being a part of the board. You know, when they make a recommendation, you don't really have to do what they recommend. You could say no or yes. But you know, just because they recommend that we need to have this and that, we could say no. We don't have to go. Because you know, when I was in the civil service, everything was a yes, and it's like assuming. So when we get a complaint by an employee from a union, we'll make a special date, and when soon as the date comes, they dropped it. Like we're gonna say yes to we're gonna take side for the staff. And not a lot of people don't believe that all the time. I like to have my own opinion, my own idea of what's yes or no. You know, at first I was against. I was like, go for it. I'm willing to. I want to hear both sides of the story. Why? But they always dropped it. Same thing. The staff's always stopping the thing. Same thing with the Cultural Heritage Board. When I see something like that happening, that is trying to argue about, they already did something behind the board to prevent it from going. That we did make the path. I moved it, and the lady next to me seconded it. You know, so I do agree that, you know, and like you said, and when you even talk about it's not a set of stone, because they could come back and say we don't want to have the culture, the structure of merit. Come back and I don't want to take it off our list. And like you said, because that's what the planning agenda. Because you know, just because you go to protocol, and go to public and all that, and they have a right and remove things like that. That's kind of like the same. That's not what they said the first time. They just wanted that information be off the ballot. I mean, off the agenda.
Right.
That's correct.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, so the point is that you locked them in.
Oh well, that issue that just disappeared. I have the assistant planner that was in charge of the negotiations has since left the department. So I don't believe any of the current assistant planners were involved with this project. But the current assistant planners have been involved with the effort to not list the PG&E building as a historic structure. And again, it's a very minor listing.
Right.
The idea that a building can really ultimately only be protected if you can get buy-in by the owner. There is no absolute way to stop it. So what you really try to do with historic boards, commissions, etc., is try to get the owners and the public to appreciate the importance of the building. And what's frustrating about this is that if you look at cities that have done historic programs in recent years, they're always successful. I would be very surprised if you could find a city in California that didn't make a significant effort to preserve heritage and culture where it hasn't been significant dividends. And the answer to that is you look at places like San Diego, Santa Barbara, Pasadena, Sacramento. In particular, the city of Los Angeles fought tooth and nail against preservation for a long time and has since been in a series of lawsuits and so forth. But even Los Angeles has turned around a great deal of improving the saving of their downtown. The downtown in Los Angeles 20 years ago was desolate. And now it's trendy places of old buildings being converted into lofts and apartments that are exactly what the young people today want. Stockton has resources and buildings that could be reutilized in all kinds of creative ways, but it is not done through a general plan of history and preservation. It is done through a capricious plan of preferential bidders and things. And if you look at the progress of downtown, I've lived in the city for 20 years now, going on 20 years since I began teaching at Delta College. The downtown has become more and more forlorn. More buildings have been lost. The historic district has lost several structures, at least a dozen, burned, but in particular 2 landmark structures, one of them outside the district, but the bedrock of the buildings that should have been preserved have been lost. Many of them were demolished by permit, many demolished by vandalism and fire. The railroad station that's actually currently listed in the 2040 plan for the city as an important structure for history in the city of Stockton, because it's a California listed registered historic structure, has been burned to the ground since that.
So when you talk about listing, what listing are you referring to? Are you talking about the Stockton listing? Are you talking about the California listing?
Well, in this case,
or the state architect listing?
mainly we're talking about city listings.
Okay.
The state of California, this is an example of what the Heritage Board has not been allowed to do simply by not allowing us to submit paper. In city code, any listed structure from the state of California, and they have essentially historic resources and they have landmarks, but they're kind of the same in the sense buildings that have been seen by the state of California is important. Any of those buildings, the board is supposed to initiate the landmarking process on. The railroad station was one of those buildings. We're talking about the Western Pacific Station.
Are you talking about the Center Street, right?
The Western Pacific Station. It's across from the Cabral station.
Oh yeah, right on the
diagonal from that. Well, it's when I say burned to the ground, it's mostly demolished because of the series of fires.
Got it. Okay.
Vandalism and arson. But in any case, such a structure, we are supposed to initiate it as a city landmark. The code is written that if the state of California says landmark or registered resource, it should be a landmark in the city. It should be a landmark in this city. But we were unable to do that because we don't have the then $4,000 and now $1,000 to submit the application. On the other hand, that building qualifies by city code to be a city landmark, and by virtue of that should be protected by city code, which it does. So the director could have fined the owners for allowing the fencing to become derelict, to allow the vandals to break in, and they never did. So here we have a structure that was, in fact, I looked it up once on a book of railroad stations by the Western Pacific Station, and that was the cover book. It was actually considered the best architectural example of a kind of mission revival rail station in the state of California. But now it's just rubble. So that building should be a city landmark. It should have been protected. It should have had code enforcement go out there. There should have been a negotiation with the owner to maintain it. None of that ever happened.
So are you, at the chair, are you authorized to get code enforcement to check on those type of situations?
Well, any citizen can do that.
Okay.
But the problem is you make a request to the Planning Development Department to enforce. You can't do that other than make a request.
Okay. Now the next one I want to talk about, the last one. We're almost the end of our show right now. Right now, can you clarify what's going on? Because right now on the public video, some of the people think that there's an animosity between the Culture Heritage Board and the staff. So is it true? Is it not true? What would be your what would be your solution of that? Because I wasn't there, so I don't know what's going on. I'm in the middle between the old board between the city. So please elaborate with that. What's going on, please?
What's happened historically with the Heritage Board is that there's been periods when the board has been utterly inactive, and then by one means or another begins to have meetings again, usually lobbying with city council, something like that.
Okay.
And in all these cases, where I've been the chair, I've had meetings with the director, tried to work out a business-like relationship, try to go over the ground rules of what we're going to do, talk about the importance of heritage preservation. It always seems we're at a new beginning. But once we start having meetings, as you've noticed, we're being told what our decision should be by the staff. We are not really there to make a decision. And as you've been at many of the meetings, I start reading city code back to them saying, we have the authority to do this.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, what results from that is then they just decide to change city code. So we can't do that thing. Last time this happened, we proposed many changes to the heritage structures in the city, and the city proposed fees for everything we did, so that if we were going to do any kind of an action, there had to be a fee to pay. We were able to stop that at the city council level through help from the State Office of Historical Preservation, who sent officers down to defend the position. Well, once again, that's happening, and this time it's going to be under the guise of due process and property rights. And there's always kind of an unsaid statement that it seems to be that heritage or history is some kind of an opinion. It's one person's history is not somebody else's. On the other hand, over and over in city documents, it refers to Secretary of the Interior standards. Our standards in the city are objective and very basic. What is historic is not flippant. It is actually a strictly following a protocol process. If the building or the structure or the place is a site or a landmark or a structure of merit, it is a arguable fact. Now, on the other hand, as a historian, the evidence can change. If the building's allowed to decay, it ceases to be historic.
Okay.
You can't really remove the fact.
When you say cease, it means to me it stopped.
Yes.
Okay.
There's one building in town in particular, the home of Moses Rogers. Moses Rogers was a man born into slavery, and after the Civil War came to Stockton. He became a mining engineer. He owned mines. He consulted. Very important local figure. He lived in a Victorian house in the south of Stockton. That building has been stripped of virtually every bit of historic fabric, siding, doors, windows. I've been inside the building. There, the banister was left. It was stripped down to the studs because of vandalism and fire and so forth. On the other hand, it's still a landmark because its historic integrity is the person who lived there and owned it, not the building itself.
Right.
But it would be so much better if you could actually stand there and look at his house as he saw it to be a historic document. The thing about buildings that don't have a historic person, the fabric, the materials, the windows, the treatments, is the document you want to see. It is the evidence you want to see about learning what history was. When that is stripped from the building, it ceases to be a document and ends up just being a shadow of what it was, like going to Disneyland.
Okay.
That's not historic. That's the image of history, but not
Got
the real
it.
thing.
Okay, now since we're close to the end of the show, I know that the video did not change on him. It's just on me a lot, So
My apologies. I
That's
thought
all
it was
right.
on-
Oh yeah, I must have. Well, whatever.
Technical difficulties. My apologies.
It's fine.
So anyway, all right, so we're at the end of our show. Chair Swanson, do you have any last word to say today for the show?
Well,
how to get in contact for more information. And I know there's going to be some kind of not rally, but something that will help us. Well, the Culture Heritage Board to get back into the business of doing preservation and about due process going up. So if anybody want to support and contact you, how do they reach you?
Well, people could reach me through, I guess, email.
Okay.
My email address is roomtoswingacat,
Okay. Just go ahead and say it.
spelled out phonetically. Room ROOM TOSWING 2cat TOCAT at Gmail.
Okay.
What's coming up in June is going to be a proposal to change the Heritage Board Chapter 16 rules, which are going to basically cripple the board, make it almost impossible for us to do anything.
So what did that mean? So, but okay, what's going to quit our duty as the function at the Culture Heritage Board, or what is it?
Well, presently the Heritage Board is supposed to go out, members on their own, begin to inquire, find structures, make recommendations to the board. The board can initiate listing as a structure of merit. The board can submit that to itself with or without an application. We can agendize that and then vote on it at the next meeting. The changes are going to be that even just to list something as a structure of merit, the city is going to want to contact the owner by certified mail, publish the proposal in the newspaper, contact all of the various property owners in the surrounding 300 feet or something.
Okay, now before let people understand what a structure of merit, what does that mean?
A structure of merit basically means the building meets the minimum standard of historic integrity.
Okay.
So it is a minor listing. So we have landmarks or something that have several reasons why the building's important, or a very important one, such as Moses Rogers, a particularly important historic figure. A structure of merit could be the last of a certain size of a Victorian. It could be the last of a style of apartment building. It can be a very minor feature, but something that historically is important. You know, for example, if we had the last McDonald's, that not that the building itself is important, but being the last one would be important. So it would be a structure of merit.
Okay.
So it is a minor listing. But our ability to do this will be very, very hampered, and in which case we really will be able to do our primary function. It puts it into the situation where the city will have to be spending significant amounts of money for us to process or make our own decision, and being that we have no budget, that probably means nothing will ever happen again. So if people are interested, they could come to the council meeting that is reviewing the Chapter 16 rules, which will be coming up in June, and voicing opposition. That could be helpful.
So are they find way to send letter to their council representative?
They could they could also contact their city council member and ask for this measure not to pass. At the very least,
because they're making they're making a good argument that it's a due process, and yet you're saying that the culture heritage. You could due process in the culture heritage board if you could go in and make it a non-historic event either way, right?
The due process is an interesting idea because it sounds very American. But the basic thing of due process is to take somebody's property without compensation and their day in court.
Right.
The listing of a structure as a structure of merit does not take any property from that person. It puts on no owner's responsibilities. The city argues that the maintenance requirements are so extra onerous that the person needs to have a protest. We can remove that. The simplest thing is add nothing to the maintenance requirements, because the reality is that the maintenance, in fact, is no different.
Okay.
Now, we can argue semantics and syntax, but the practical aspect it is not. The purpose of listing is to make the building appreciated and to make it available for historic benefits. So if we had 1,000 listed structures of merit, non-historical districts, the property owners would definitely see a benefit.
Okay.
So it is not so much a taking away of property, but giving property. Objection also meant is, well, there has to be an appeal process. Under current city code, anybody can ask that their designation be rescinded, which is removal. The city says there must be an appeal. An appeal is a request, a lawsuit, a request for a rescission. You can directly ask for a rescission now at any time on your property.
Under the Culture Heritage Board?
Under current rules.
Current rules.
So you could go to the Heritage Board and say, my house is not a structure of merit, and you can argue that it is. Now, again, it's objective. If it is unique architecture, it should be listed, or special, unique, historic. If a person of importance lived there, granted. But the idea that there is not an appeal, there's an immediate direct request for rescission.
Okay.
So the words, again, semantics and syntax can be argued, but the process is the same. Other side of the coin is we're appointed by the Planning Commission. A future Heritage Board could interpret the rules less stringently or more stringently and remove and add structures. So this is not cast in stone. Historic preservation is always the responsibility of the community and the property owners to appreciate it. The main purpose of the Heritage Board is to educate and get people to appreciate the history that they may possess.
Okay.
It is an honor to have a historic building in your possession, and it should be taken care of and appreciated.
I totally agree with you. I'm 100% on board what you're saying. Thank you for Wesley Swanson for coming. I hope you come back again.
Thank you for having me.
Hopefully this time your face be on the video on the last minute. You know, I realize it. Like
you pushed the camera, Doug. That's why it went off. Angle only showed you.
All right.
That's okay. I'm sorry. All right. Anyways, I want to before we we go off the air, I want to thank our sponsor for the, what do you call it, CCPR5. What that is?
It's the Chicano Community Program Reunion. It's the 5th one. Betty Ramirez is running it. That's just a list of some of the sponsors that are going to be helping.
Right. So the top sponsor is State Farm, PG&E, We're Getting and Building a Better Future, GRA Architecture plus Associate Industry Architect Counseling and Planning. Thank you. Demand Realty Group at Work for You, City-Wise Towing, the Next Generation Towing, Rio Body Shop, School Not Prison, Daniel Sylvia of Self-Awareness Recovery, and many more. Thank you for sponsoring us. Hopefully you buy the ticket and come to the show and an event. And thank you for watching the Vigil show, and also thank you for watching The Voice of San Joaquin. And have a great weekend. Bye bye.